Welcome to another Cafe Insights, except today I'm not in a cafe, I'm actually in the kitchen, but it's serving coffee, which is the main thing, and I'm in conversation with Tom Standage from The Economist, digital editor and editor of Technology Quarterly. Hi, Tom.
Hello.
So here I am in London, coming to meet you this time. I wanted to just ask you a little bit about the work that you do. You've been the technology correspondent, you've been business editor, The Economist, and now digital editor and manage economist.com. So tell us a little bit about the work and the key things and themes that run through what you're editing and writing about these days.
I suppose my job at The Economist is to sort of be the radar at the front of the spaceship, scanning the future for new things that come along. And I used to solely do that in an editorial capacity, so I was just looking for new stuff that we should be writing about when I was technology correspondent, and then I've been technology editor, in fact, since 2003, so I edit our Tech Quarterly. So there I'm looking for new things, and then I'm getting other people to write about them, but essentially I'm responsible for us staying on top of those ideas. And then I got more and more interested in how media itself was changing, and I started writing about that, and I started bellyaching about what we ought to be doing internally. So I got put in charge of our apps, our website, economist.com, and so forth. So actually, part of the time, I'm actually implementing this stuff rather than just writing about how people ought to be doing it. But that's very much the nature of The Economist. It's a very small organisation and we wear lots of hats. So essentially, there I am scanning the future. I think what I do that maybe is different from the way other people do this is that I'm a big fan of using history to look at the future. And what can we learn about, for example, if I'm evaluating a new technology, how likely is it to succeed? And one way of looking at that is to look at history. How often have people tried this sort of thing before? Why did different things in the past succeed or fail? And that's what my books have also been doing, looking at modern technologies in the light of previous technologies. So these historical analogies that exist between something like the telegraph network of the 19th century and the internet today. So that's essentially my stock in trade, which is using the past as a lens to look at the future.
Right. And I know that there's been a few books. One was the Victorian Internet. Was your first book?
That was my first book in 1998, yeah.
I know another one, I've read a couple about the world in 6 glasses and the edible history of the world.
Yeah, so I did a book about the history of drinking and another about the history of food, but both of which give you ways of looking at current debates about what we eat and drink. And then I did a book about the Mechanical Turk, which was a sort of robot built in the 18th century that played chess, and it led to a great debate about whether machines could think or not, which we're still having today. And it's very interesting that many of the reactions people had then to the prospect of thinking machines are very similar to the reactions that people are having today. So essentially that's what I'm doing in each of these books. I'm saying that human nature tends to look pretty similar, whereas the technologies come and go, but we tend to react to them in the same way.
The reason I'm not meeting you in the Tower, The Economist, and here instead is because you've taken a little bit of time out to write your latest book, which is looking at social media and the implications of that.
Yes, so I'm looking at the prehistory of social media, starting with the Romans and going up to the beginning of the 19th century. And the basic idea is that media has actually been social for most of history, certainly for most of the past 2,000 years. And we then had this interlude of industrial mass media where we got our information from machines, whether it was printing presses spewing out hundreds of thousands of copies, or radio or TV. And now we're going back to a world where we get information from other people and we pass information along social networks. And so I think we can learn a great deal about what's happening in social media now by looking at the social media environments of the past, such as coffee houses in the 17th century, the letters that were passed around among the Roman elite in the 1st century BC, which is where I start. The book's going to be called Cicero's Web, and Cicero's letters are, I think, one of the first examples of a social media system. But I've got lots of other examples as well. Luther, in the Reformation, uses pamphlets brilliantly, and that's a kind of very successful early social media campaign. And there are other examples as well. There's the Facebook of the Tudor court, for example. There's the pamphlets of the Civil War era in England. The French Revolution was also helped along with the use of social media. So there is a very rich seam of history to mine here, and I think it really can tell us very useful things about social media today.
Is social media a real revolution?
Well, yes and no. I mean, you can look at examples in the past of where it has made a real difference, but at the same time, when the printing press came along or when coffee houses came along, people made very utopian claims about them. And those claims were not borne out, but nor were the sort of doom-laden warnings that were issued. So one of the chapters I've recently been working on is on coffee houses, and if you look at the reaction to coffee houses, which were a new thing in England in the 1650s and 60s, and they were a place where, in those days, if we were meeting them, we'd have met in a coffee house, and that would have been a respectable place to meet, whereas if I'd suggested that we meet in a tavern, that would have not been respectable. So it was a neutral, respectable place where people could go and do business, and they would also read the news, and they would get their mail there, because that was where you had your mail sent to. You'd say, send it to me at the Rainbow Coffee House or whatever. And you would also meet all sorts of people, and the idea was that you would be able to talk to anyone, you would be encouraged to talk to anyone, that any sort of social distinctions would be left at the door. And this was an incredibly egalitarian information environment in which ideas could bounce off each other and people could bounce off each other. And people worried that this was so addictive that people were spending all day in the coffee house when they ought to be working or doing their studies. So both in Oxford and Cambridge, you get officials of the university saying they're wasting all their time in coffee houses, no one's studying anymore. And actually, if you look at those warnings, it's very similar to people saying, oh, people waste all their time on Twitter or blogging.
We're worried like that as employers and as parents.
Right? Yes, exactly. So it's sometimes called social not working. And I think actually the lesson of history is if you look at what came out of the coffee houses of the 1670s and 80s, we had two big things. The scientific revolution was one of them. This is where scientists met to exchange theories, do experiments and so on, and argue, which led to the great discoveries that they made. And then the financial revolution, things like the stock market and Lloyd's, both came out of coffee houses in London. There were all sorts of innovations around joint stock companies and so forth. So actually, when you put people together in this sort of information-rich environment, they collaborate in ways you maybe aren't going to expect. And I think that's one of the big lessons for companies today, that actually the use of social media within companies, rather than being something you should ban because people will waste their time, it's the kind of thing you should encourage. And we're seeing the use of social media by companies. We've seen it increasingly in the last couple of years, and Yammer has just been bought by Microsoft for $1 billion. Yammer's basically Facebook for the enterprise. It looks just like Facebook. And I think that's actually very sensible, because you can find other people within the company and collaborate with them much more easily than you would if you were going to send out, I don't know, an email to everyone in the company saying, does anyone know about this? I mean, that will just annoy people.
So the big buzzword at the moment is innovation, and companies seem to need to embrace this or die, and the way would be through good collaboration.
Well, I think this is one of the levers you should pull, which is that it's much easier for people to discover expertise within a company, to form groups, to essentially have this collision, this fizzing of ideas bashing into each other that was happening in coffee houses and can now happen in a social media environment, whether that's a consumer one or a corporate one.
Within your own company. So Tom, I know that you always keep an updated list of the emerging technologies of the future that are going to change our world. What's top of the list at the moment?
Yes, I'm always looking out for new technologies that are worth keeping an eye on, things I think we should be writing more about in our pages at The Economist. So at the moment, things I'm interested in, we seem to see robotics coming back up the field a lot, and people sort of talking about robots in a serious way, not sort of sci-fi. And drones are obviously a big part of this. So drone aircraft, obviously being used in the military, but they're things that hobbyists can build as well. And when hobbyists start to be able to build things that are comparable to the military versions, then that tells you something's happening. Another example where that's happening is 3D printing. So 3D printing is something that big companies are using for prototyping. They have done for years, but again, the hobbyists are in there building these sort of $2,000 3D printers. Could be incredibly disruptive, because you could have the piracy of physical objects. You'd be able to sort of download the plans for a toy and print it out, that sort of thing. Another thing I think is very interesting is augmented reality. At the moment, it's a bit of a party trick. This is where you hold up your phone, your smartphone, and it paints information onto the world. I think once we can combine that with social information, so that would mean coupling this to social media in some way, it would become much more useful. And we're already seeing, Google is talking about glasses that you wear that paint stuff over the world. Microsoft seems to be working on the same thing. Apple must do, if only so they can call it the eyeglasses. So that's something I'm sure is going to come. Another technology I'm very interested in is called nanopore sequencing, and it's where you essentially sequence DNA by pulling it through a very small hole and measuring the resistance of the medium that you're pulling it through. And that allows you to sequence a genome of a whole person, probably in less than an hour for less than $1,000 in the next couple of years. And that's an amazing step forward, because we'll get to the point where we'll be able to sequence really large numbers of people and crunch the data and find out some really useful information about drugs and the way diseases propagate and so forth. And then another technology that seems to have a lot of momentum at the moment, this year in particular, is mobile payments. The idea that you can pay for things by waving your phone, use your phone as your keys and your wallet. And we're seeing lots of announcements, but we're actually seeing lots of stuff being rolled out as well. And it can't all work, and we're not quite sure how this is going to shake out. And Apple hasn't done anything about this yet, and Apple has a sort of king-making effect in these markets. So it'd be very interesting to see what they decide to do, if anything, with the iPhone 5. But these are the sorts of things that I'm sort of constantly looking for more information about and trying to work out what's going to happen, because I think they're the most exciting areas to look at.
Mind-boggling stuff. I know people really do appreciate the kind of insights you have and the kind of perspective that you give to some of the things that we're thinking about in our business and our lives. So thanks, Tom, very much, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.